Start with one big issue. It's actually something that applies to all writing fairly well right now, especially right now. When the unfortunate mad fever for memoir fiction started to peter out. Thank you. Neither do I. There was a little bit of a moment of like, you know, what do we do now kind of thing. And it affected me right at the time that I was planning to do what the project that eventually became The Alienist, because I had been reading a lot of, I've been doing a lot of crime stuff and research for various reasons. And I had been planning to do a book, and I had been focusing more and more on what at that time was a sparsely covered topic, which was serial killers. Now the most unfortunately overtrodden ground that there is. But I wanted to do something about them at the time, but there seemed to be I was coming off of doing a lot of nonfiction. My publisher wanted more nonfiction. So did my agent. She's sitting right up here. Throw things at her if you want to. So there was the question of what do I have to offer the genre that the rest of the world doesn't have? Why should they want to read a book by me about this? And the answer eventually came to me, and it took a little while. That the thing to do was to marry the two, was to take history, which was the thing that I had, and marry it with a thriller about a serial killer. And specifically, the spark on what to do for the plot was when I read one of my, what up to that point had been one of my favorite authors, Tom Harris, whose Red Dragon was a spectacular book. And then everybody started reading Silence of the Lambs, and I didn't really want to read it until I was ready. I didn't want to John Grisham once told me that he never reads fiction when he's writing his own books because, I hope he doesn't kill me for repeating this story, but I think he'll be all right. He never likes to read other people's fiction when he's writing his own books because he's worried about other people's style and approach unconsciously borrowing from them. And I think that's a very honest statement from him, and I think it's very fair for all of us. So I didn't really want to read it, but then I was going out with a girl who was calling me up in the middle of the night, every night from her family's beach house saying, "I'm terrified, I'm terrified." So I was like, "Could you just relax? It's a book." But then I thought, all right, I'll read it too. So I started it, and it was one of the great premises that I've ever seen or ever read. This notion that a convicted terrible serial killer from a jail cell was going to help this young FBI agent solve this string of murders based only on the case notes. And for the first, I don't know, 60% of the book, that's what it is. And I thought, this is great. This is a beautiful sequel to Red Dragon. Then we got to the unfortunate contrivance of the book, which is that it turned out there is a big gay pen pal club of serial killers that all know each other, and he knew who the killer was, and they were all in touch with each other, and it was just like, what the hell? And it infuriated me. So, but I'd been playing already with the idea of, and this is what sort of just kicked me into high gear, I'd been already playing with the idea of the duality of a psychiatrist coming from a similarly violent background to a serial killer and a killer himself. Why does one go one way and one go the other? And that was the theme that would eventually become the book, but people often mistakenly think that I set out to write a fiction book about 1890s New York. That's not true. Once I had the plot, once I had the characters, then I went shopping for a time period. And what I did was I just kept going back and going back and going back to the earliest point where people could be reasonably, credibly believed to be speaking in these terms about a murderer. And that happened to be the 1890s. And then it was a perfect time period because of a lot of coincidences that occurred at the time. But what I learned out of that, in terms of finding a new way to write fiction, because I'd already had one unfortunate experience writing fiction right out of the gate when I got out of college, which had been the whole autobiographical thing, which we all have to get out of our system. Unfortunately, it only sold like 1,500 copies, so there aren't that many people who've seen it. And it really was not an enjoyable experience. But you publish that kind of stuff and you either love having the experience, and I was just like, no, because people were saying, people just didn't, you are not going to be understood. But anyway, that doesn't matter. Even if you like to write that stuff and read that stuff, this is not about that. We're talking about mystery fiction. And in mystery fiction, the one thing that matters above all is something you can just call universalization, which is the basic guiding rule. It can apply to all fiction, but it certainly applies to mystery fiction, is it's not interesting just because it happened to you. You can apply it to a lot of conversation, too. So the point of that is that I realized I didn't have to just invent people to do what I was doing. That I could do what I wanted to do, which was write a book about some very difficult experiences in my own life. In addition, that had been what had led me to my initial interest in military history, then to my interest in crime. It was all about violence, and I wanted to explore that more. The origins of it, the effects on people. Why do certain people who have violent backgrounds go one way and certain people don't follow that? And find out as much as you could possibly find out about the reasons why. And that was sort of the inspiration for Dr. Kreitzler in The Alienist, was that I realized, I am not a 19th century German psychologist, but I didn't have to be. But emotionally, we could be rooted in the same things. Our experiences could be similar. So then it became an issue of mechanics. How do you write a mystery when you've never written a mystery before? And I very quickly came to understand one thing in mystery fiction from all of it. From Aristotle, we got action is character. But in mystery fiction, much of action is dialogue. It is necessary in mystery fiction for characters to spend long periods of time just talking about. And this is something a couple of friends of mine and I were just discussing, that there was a very difficult scene in The Alienist. That is the scene where they all have this big sumptuous dinner and they're talking about the most horrifying kind of crimes committed against children while they're eating all this delightful food. And it was the scene that was going to be the make or break scene of the book, because it was kind of, it distilled everything down to this one moment where people were just talking about this mystery and these horrors, but they were doing what they ordinarily do. So you had the only action that was going to take place, aside from waiters occasionally coming in and out and people talking about how they like the food, which is admittedly limited for action, the only action that was going to take place was going to be people talking. So there is a sub-rule when it comes to mystery fiction to the old action as character thing, which is that dialogue is action, which then becomes character. Now that's hard because there's a lot of ways to write dialogue thinking that you're revealing the person, but you're really not. When a person is talking about themselves, they very rarely tell you anything about themselves. When they are talking about something else, and particularly something really crucial, you'll often learn much more about them than you will hearing their life story, which will generally make you want to pound your head on the table after a while. So picking up that sort of rule, self-made up rule, I could move from there, and really the action scenes in The Alienist, which, there are scenes of physical action, and they kind of became, once I realized that this was really how almost all mysteries work. If you take the average, go out now to any bookstore and buy the average mystery from the bestseller list, the book is at least 70, 80% just dialogue. Just the guy going around interviewing people, or just sitting at a table just talking with somebody, or consulting with somebody about the case. There's comparatively little physical action involved in good mysteries. Sherlock Holmes, there are entire stories where, very little actually happens. So the focus is on those things, learning how to write characters who can talk for extensive periods of time, reveal themselves not in what they are saying about themselves, but in what they are saying about what they're doing, and usually what they and a group of other people, or one other person, or a group of other people are doing. You don't learn about Sherlock Holmes because what he says about himself. He says very little about himself. He doesn't like talking about himself. But he's constantly jabbering to Watson about the case that they're working on, and as he does, you form a picture of who he is. It doesn't have to be everybody else's picture, but it is a definite picture for each reader, and that's where it comes from. So that rule would definitely be, don't be afraid of dialogue in mystery writing, just because it's dialogue. A lot of people get scared when they think about, reading a book or writing a book that is largely dialogue. It's hard to write good dialogue. It's hard to write, it's something you have to really work at. Most people think it's really easy, which is why most people don't end up getting published, because most of the time people don't want to listen to people, because people end up talking about themselves directly. And that's the most tedious thing in the world. So that's to be stayed away from in mystery fiction. Only at the most, there can be one or two critical moments in every mystery where somebody actually talks to somebody else about themselves. Great sleuths don't talk about themselves. They sometimes reveal elements of themselves to somebody, like I say, at moments that are crucial. But by and large, they don't talk about themselves, and yet, from what they say about something, about what they're doing, you learn a great deal about them. And they often don't do very much, like I say. It's interesting that ever since mystery fiction was devised in the 19th century, and that's mostly where I got my influences from, obviously. And a lot of people think it's really unfortunate that I have tried to update those dynamics into the 20th century. Everybody's entitled to an opinion, but the simple fact of the matter is, We had Raymond Chandler. We don't need the 18 billion pretenders to the Raymond Chandler throne that we've had ever since. You know, we've had the hard-boiled detectives. We've had anybody can be a detective. If Agatha Christie taught us anything, besides the key fact, which I hope everybody here already knows if they're coming to this thing, you always start writing a mystery from the end. The thing you have in mind is the solution, and you work backwards from there. That was the goal. That is the goal. Agatha Christie didn't come up with that idea. That goes all the way back to Dickens and Wilkie Collins and Edgar Allan Poe. But she did sort of elaborate it very clearly and very nicely. That's a tough one, because you can get suckered on that one. You can think, okay, I've got enough to start. I don't know exactly how it ends, but I've got enough to start. And the next thing you know, you're going to find yourself lost. And because of the second thing, which is what matters in a great mystery. Is it a great detective that matters in a great mystery? Yes. But even more crucial, as Alfred Hitchcock said, every good story is only as good as the villain. And if you don't have a great villain, then you're never going to have a great sleuth. So it's to remember those kind of parallel tracks, because we see this all the time, you know, when the inevitable scene of the sleuth and the villain facing off comes, and in the cheaper versions of it, you get some speech about how in another lifetime we could have been friends and all that crap, which sometimes isn't crap. Sometimes it's well done. It's better done in things like science fiction, but it's not. It's rarely done very well in mystery fiction. But there is a real importance to that idea of the duality. You've got to have both those characters. You can't start out with just a great detective and think that you're going to get where you're going. That's something I think that Agatha Christie didn't necessarily serve, because everybody got so fixated on the quirkiness of her detectives that they lost a lot of sight of the fact that in her greatest mysteries there are great villains. And certainly in the greatest Sherlock Holmes stories, obviously. Sherlock Holmes would have never existed without Professor Moriarty. And really, in my lousy opinion, my 2 cents, that's why they should have left him alone. And when Sherlock Holmes went over the Reichenbach Falls with Professor Moriarty, they should have let Conan Doyle kill them both off at that moment. That would have been the absolute perfect ending. But of course, the public and his publisher were so unrelentingly hounding that, and after that, the stories suffer. The stories are not as good after that. You get once in a while, you get a good one, but a lot of them are just pot boilers, and because he was working on a lot of other stuff that's really good. Nobody reads it, or some people read it, but he was working on a lot of other books that were terrific. But they didn't get a fair shake because they didn't let him kill Sherlock Holmes off. This is not leading anywhere. Lest this sounds like it is. This is not leading to anything about my intentions, which I don't really want to talk about right at this moment. Although I gather we're going to have a question and answer session as soon as I run out of things to say, so somebody will inevitably ask me. I'll run screaming downstairs. So, okay, you've got all of those elements. You've got all of these rules to play by. What's going to matter after that? Structure. There is possibly no writing form that is more disciplined, that should be more disciplined, I should say, because there's an awful lot that isn't, that should be as disciplined as mysteries. And the terrible paradox of it is you start out in mysteries creating an incredible structure that you're so impressed with. It became sort of a famous story at the time the book was published. My entire living room in my little apartment, 3 walls, were covered with index cards, planning out the entire story. And then I created all these characters who proceeded to be good enough characters that they defied probably 70% of that structure. And at first I was trying very hard to make them go back and do what they were supposed to do. And the answer was, of course, a big fuck you. We're going to do what we want to do. And they did. But that's an important realization, because sometimes you're going to think you're failing if that happens. You're not failing. That's actually a sign that you're succeeding. Because that's the final piece I would give you, is that yes, you have to plan it out, even knowing that probably most of your plan is going to be defied by your characters if your characters are any good. Because if your characters are any good, let's say you've got a sleuth, you've put a lot of yourself into him, but following this idea of universalization of it's not interesting just because it happened to me. You put in a lot of stuff that's maybe inspired by things you went through, that is maybe dramatized forms of things you went through. So you've got a good sleuth, you've got friends of his, you've got a good team to go with them, and they will defy you, and they should defy you if they're good characters. If you can move them around like pieces on a chessboard, well, that's probably as interesting as your book will be. A game of chess played with yourself, which if anybody's, we always have these great, I love these scenes of where you go in and see some Machiavellian genius who's sitting there playing chess with himself. If anybody's ever tried playing chess with themselves, it's an absolutely idiotic exercise, because you always know what you're going to do on the other side. So all you end up doing, it's like playing tic-tac-toe. It's a draw every time, because of course you're thinking in the back of your head, okay, I'm going to do this, but secret, oh yeah, well I'm going to go over there and do that, and it's like, but we're supposed to believe these guys are super clever because they play chess by themselves. The only time it ever works is when you're dealing with somebody who has a serious, dissociative disorder. And they can actually split off and not realize what they're doing, or at least fool themselves into believing that they don't know what they're doing when they go back and forth. Otherwise, it's just idiotic. These are the kind of little tropes that get developed in really bad mystery fiction, and it's a dead sign that you're really in trouble. And I'm waiting for somebody to do some kind of a comedy thing of meeting an evil genius who's playing chess with himself and he's driving himself insane because he always knows what he's going back and forth doing. But it's a sign that you're really succeeding if your characters don't do what you want them to do. Now, how does that match up against the fact that you're working backwards from the beginning? From the ending. Well, that's when they do have to fall in line by the ending. You know where they have to get to and what they have to do for the last chunk of the book. But you have to take them out of almost everything in the middle and then get them back again. it's like if any of you play music, any kind of improvisational music. You start out with a theme, you go off into your own little world and play your whatever, and then you realize, shit, I've got to find a way to get back into this song. And you don't always really make it successfully, but the really good ones do. The really good ones do. So it's very much like that. And then, if all works out, you're golden. So that's all you have to do. And that's all I have to tell you. Beyond that, it's just up to you. I'm happy to ask any questions about that process that you would like to ask, but I don't like to make it sound glib and simplistic. It's as hard as hell. And it's wrenching to do, but all I can tell you is you'll get there. I think I was lucky. I wrote an article about this once. I think I was particularly lucky that I started out writing history, because history makes you do that. History makes you do all of these things, no matter what and particularly biography, which it's no coincidence to me that I had just written a biography before I wrote The Alienist, because the two, all biographers, no matter what they say, fall in love with their subject to a certain extent, even if they officially don't like them, or if it's politically incorrect for them to like them. They end up falling for them. You can't sustain the amount of time on one person that you need to, and the amount of enthusiasm for that person that you need to, and be critical of them the entire time. It's boring. It's energy sapping. And that's why so many critical biographies are really just rants. They're not biographies at all. They're sort of hit jobs. But history does prepare you in a very interesting way for writing, not only fiction, but really for writing mysteries in particular, because history obeys a lot of the same rules. And I was lucky, I think, to have that training first, and to have had it first in my interests. I've often said that if anybody had told me in high school that I would end up writing fiction, or that I would be known for writing fiction, I would have said they were out of their minds. Nothing I would have rather been less associated with, for reasons in my past that are reasons in my past, in my family. I had a lot of fiction writers in my family, and I wasn't going down that road, and I actually didn't. I ended up doing the kind of books that they really disparaged, and they had already done the kind of books that I could not understand for the life of me. So it does work. You can make it work, but it's a much more disciplined, tough thing to do than most people think. Mystery is not an easy way to go. It really isn't. And the number of people who can do it successfully, a really good mystery, and we're not just talking about a good character here, which too many mysteries try to hang themselves on. It was a real, is a really sort of quirky, interesting guy, and then it turns out the mystery is like, nah. But a really good mystery story is one of the hardest things in the world to come up with. But you can do it if you really approach it from a different point of view than any other fiction, which is why it's really important for people to understand that going in, because it is not an easy way out. Everybody thinks they've got a great mystery they could write. and they may have it. They just can't write it. It's unbelievably difficult. Okay, so moving right along. I think we can move right along. What time is it?
7:50.
That's good enough. 45 minutes was what they told me. Well, that is what you told me. Questions?
Do you have a particular routine when you're working on a piece, on a book?
Absolutely not. Except for one. You try to get something done every day. That can be research. That can be writing. It may be an hour. It may be 5 hours. My unfortunately no longer with us mentor James Chase and I once figured out, he was also somebody who had written both fiction and mostly nonfiction. And we had written a book together, and we kind of figured out at one point that after 4 hours of writing, it's really all the quality work you're going to get. After that, you're either grinding your gears or fooling around, doing something else and sitting at your desk pretending you're writing, and you might as well do that on the couch. There's a great story about Mario Puzo. You may have heard this one where they interviewed him and his wife, who had absolutely no understanding of what he did for a living. I mean, she was a very old traditional Italian woman. She took the writer into his study and showed him that there was a desk and a couch, and said, "I don't know why everybody gets so excited about him writing. I never see him writing. 90% of the time he's lying on this couch staring at the ceiling." Well, a lot of the time that's just process. So but you try to do it every day. That's why it's important to have a separate area or room to do it in. And whatever your condition, you drag yourself in there every day. And like I say, it may be an hour, it may be 4 hours, 5 hours. But you try to do it every day. Unless somebody calls you and wants to go play golf or something, and then you're fucked. So that's the only routine, really.
Manual or digital?
You know, I wish I was still working on a manual typewriter, because I think the digital age has made us all faster but worse writers, in a sense. I did write The Alienist on a computer, but it was one of the original IBM PCs, which was almost a typewriter. You really couldn't do very much on those things, and they had those great clicky, well, they were really good for you. They were actually healthy, and they're making sort of imitation versions of them now. DOS keyboards, they're called, and they're really good, because there's a neurological thing, which I only found out the hard way, that when you've got, like, the keyboards that come with like a Mac, where the keys are literally 1/8 of an inch higher than the board itself, or some keyboards are just a flat piece of plastic, to sit there banging away on that for hours on end is actually awful for you neurologically. It creates what's called a neurological feedback loop. That energy that just think, you're sitting there basically doing this for hours a day, and you're not noticing that it hurts because you're not doing it that hard. But your hands are noticing. And a lot of people come up with, there's no coincidence that a lot of writers come up with really strange and exotic neurological diseases, myself included. That's why I say I had to learn the hard way. If I could still be working on that old IBM, I would be. If I could still be working on my old manual Royal typewriter, I would be. But there's not a publisher alive who's going to let you work on that schedule. You know, everybody demands speed at this point. Use.
Okay, well, this is a little off topic on technique. It's more about location. I have a burning mystery that I've been wondering about since reading The Alienist and living quite near to Grace Church.
Okay.
Did you, to find the office or to locate the office for Chrysler and their, ruminations, were you in the building overlooking the courtyard of Grace Church? Or how did you come up with that?
I'll tell you a funny story about that.
You must have been there.
When I was going to NYU, we lived in a floor-through commercial loft on 10th Street, illegally. A bunch of people, friends of mine and I, we lived in a floor-through commercial loft on 10th Street between University and Broadway, right there at Grace Church. There was a bar around the corner where it had live music on Broadway, and we used to go to it all the time. Certain people, and this is true, I was not one of them, because I grew up in the Episcopal Church. And even though I parted ways with them, respect. So, but friends of mine would go into the grounds of Grace Church and into that big urn that they have. They'd jump into that giant urn and get stoned in there. Fill the whole thing up with smoke and get incredibly stoned. And I'd be out there screaming at them to get out. Years later, but it was a fascinating spot. It is a fascinating spot, and it's just such a gorgeous place. Years later, my shrink moved his office so that when you were lying on the couch in his office, you were staring right at the top floor of that building.
Of the building or the church?
Right across Broadway into the top floor of number 808. And I used to sit there staring at those windows and seeing not a lot was going on in there in those days. I don't think anybody was even living in almost all of it. So, but I'd see people occasionally passing by, and I sat there and I said, if you wanted to have a place, because that area was all department stores and all kinds of stuff was going on there in the 1890s. I said this would be a great place to sort of hide in plain sight if you had something like a team of detectives. And then I got the inevitable question: what are you thinking about now? That. So that's really how it happened. It was complete.
You were never in the building?
Well, I was in the building subsequently, but I never lived there. If anybody owns that building, I think I have rights, squatters' rights to the top floor. They then remodeled the building to kind of have the theme of the book, which I thought was wonderfully complimentary if they had given me an apartment in the damn building.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Are you working on a new book at the moment?
Maybe we can just talk about that. I am, and it is going to be an Alienist book, which is all I'm prepared to say at this moment, because some of you may be aware of the fact that we're in a little bit of flux on the subject of the Alienist, a multimedia flux, and exactly what that will mean for what I can't tell you really what I can't. There's a lot I can't tell you. So I don't really want to get sued by both Turner Communications and Paramount Studios.
Favorite writers?
Oh God.
I know that's a very naughty question.
You mean contemporary writers?
Anything. Yes, contemporary.
A lot of them I just pointed out. Go down the list. Poe, huge. Wilkie Collins, big. Dickens, enormous. Tolstoy, enormous. But not Anna Karenina. I'm on the other side. there is a clear divide in life between people who like War and Peace and people who like Anna Karenina, and we just don't like each other. Kipling, huge. Conan Doyle, huge. H.G. Wells, big. I'm trying to go more modern for you,
Yeah.
but it gets really, really hard. Raymond Chandler, huge. But not, as I said, not, for me, not a direct influence in terms of style, obviously, but still somebody, you know, that I love to read. And then once you get more modern than that, it gets sort of esoteric and weird. It's like, one of my absolutely all-time favorite modern, and I guess he's still considered a modern, I don't know how fast we're moving, what was considered modern, but William Gibson was a huge deal for me. I don't know how he hasn't been more acknowledged for what he wrote. I mean, you know, I'm glad everybody loved those stupid Matrix movies so much, but really he should have sued them. I mean, they just completely ripped off the Neuromancer series. I'm trying really hard to think of somebody else. Well, Tom Harris, like I said. Red Dragon. Red Dragon was the only book I think that he really wanted to write. Can you wait just one second? There was somebody right there who had her hand up. Did you buy the speaker? Somebody buy that speaker? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Music, do you write with it or don't write with it?
Almost always write with it. I would say 99.9% write with it.
What kind of music?
Always classical. Like pets and plants, writing does not survive with other forms of music. That's my personal belief. I love other kinds of music, but I feel like I'm 106 years old when I try to play it and work because I end up going, stop that noise! So, yeah.
I was just going to throw a couple of authors into the mix just out of curiosity. John Irving. You know, not everybody reads everybody. John Irving.
Never got it.
Anthony Trollope.
Trollope, I tried. I really tried, and I know people who are a very good friend of mine, is a Trollope fiend, the way I'm. That's another divide I found in life. There are Trollope people and there are Dickens people. And
I cannot read Dickens.
there you go.
Great Trollope.
See?
And the other is Robertson Davies.
Again,
Oh, a master.
I know, you are not alone in that opinion,
A
but.
master of masters.
Ruth Rendell.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I gravitate more towards people like Patricia Highsmith. And, I read P.D. James for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Robert Graves. I Claudius.
Well, yeah. Absolutely.
Byron.
And goodbye to all that, which is
Never read that.
that's his memoir
Yeah, I know.
of leaving England.
One would have to live about 5,000 years to get through one's readings.
It's very true. I have a feeling that we all taper off as time goes on. It's weird, you know. We go through this fury of reading for like the first, I don't know, probably 30, 40 years of our lives, and then we become very set in our ways. I mean, I've read War and Peace 3 times. There's no reason to read War and Peace 3 times when you got all these people that you never read. But, you know, I start to read them and I go, and you pull down War and Peace and start reading it. It just feels better. Maybe that has to do something to do with the soothing quality of people that you already know where you're going. Anybody else? Yes.
As a historian, I'm sure that when you were researching New York in the 1890s, you came up with tons and reams of historical facts that you could not use because it would overwhelm the novel? Did you find it very hard to push it aside,
Yes,
pick and choose?
at very best, this is if you're including a lot, you will use maybe 25% of your research. And in most cases, it's more like 10 to 15. The rest is just stuff that has to inform you. And that informs your sensibility and your creation of characters, but it's not stuff that you can, even at that, you know, even with the Alienist, there's a lot of people who, at the time it came out, were complaining, you know, oh God, these long scenes about walking by Trinity Church and the graveyard, why do we have to hear about this shit in the mystery stuff? And there's some logic to it now. We're all living in a weird time. You know, I am not convinced that if the Alienist were published tomorrow, it would be the success that it was, by any stretch of the imagination.
Why is that? Why?
It's too long and detailed. Go on Amazon and just listen to what people say. If it's longer than 400 pages, they throw a shit fit. And you know, and the thing about Amazon is they're friggin' sharks. You know, once one person says something negative, they all want in. They smell the blood and they all want in. And Amazon's got this filthy deal going on with publishers that you might as well know about now, where publishers, that early readers program, well, it's not straight. It's not a straight game. Publishers pay Amazon to get their books in the early reading program. If the book does well, but here's the problem, they don't send out the book, they send out the unfinished gallery. And therefore, of course, there's a lot of people who don't like them. So, if the book does well, the payoff for the publisher at the other end is Amazon will promote it more on Amazon. If it doesn't do well, goodbye. Amazon's not going to do anything. It's a crooked game. It's a lousy game. It's totally typical of Amazon. And I say this as someone who gets most of the things he needs from Amazon because nobody else is coming the million miles that they have to come to find my house. Yeah.
How do you arrive at your?
I'm not giving you a question.
Just look for Vine on the on Amazon
Yes,
website.
Amazon
That's how you-
Vine is
okay.
what,
If
Amazon,
next to the review, if it has a person's name that says Vine,
in little green
no
letters.
publisher, so if it, like, they're a Vine reviewer, that means they're participating in this program.
Yeah, they're swine, and they get free,
So you could just,
and they get free merchandise. for
yeah, they're
participating.
different swag and
If they, you know, they can pick something they really like and review it and get like a free television or free facial products or whatever. Yes, go.
How do you create your plots? How do you find your plots? The ones that your characters aren't going to do, but you start somewhere.
That's a tricky question because if the question is how do you pick a plot? How do you find a plot? Really, it's you just have to trust that if it's a subject that interests you, you can make it interesting to other people. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. But if you're working correctly, it usually once you start the research. And there's always in mystery, there's an enormous amount of research involved, no matter what certain authors who publish 2 or 3 books a year might try to disprove. There's an enormous amount of research involved in most mysteries. And usually about, you'll be in the research for a while and you'll be able to say to yourself, straight up, is this really interesting or is it just interesting to me? And you have to have that honest conversation with yourself. And you end up abandoning the ones that and you don't even go to anybody. You don't talk to anybody until you know you've got one. And really, for me, with the Alienist, it came with the curious set of coincidences in the 1890s. It wasn't just that it was plausible for it to happen in the 1890s, but there was the fact that Theodore Roosevelt, who I had studied my whole life and written about my whole life, he was police commissioner in 1896. There was the fact that if I had people his age involved in the story, they could have all been at Harvard together taking classes under William James. So the first psychological laboratory in the United States, it all, once those coincidences start to roll, that's what takes you, that's what makes you say, aha, now I have it. If you don't get those, you'll never be able to force them. You'll never be able to make up anything that doesn't work. It's the big aha moments, but really, you have to be able to be honest with yourself. It's sort of like admitting that, it's not interesting just because it happened to me. It's also not interesting just because you think it's interesting. You have to really be straight with yourself about, is this something I could make interesting to other people? And that's tougher. Then, as far as specific plot points, you are going to draw those out of what's important to you. Whether it's your life, whether it's your whatever part of your life, your early life, something that happened to you, your marriage, whatever. It's being able to elaborate on those points that and make them unrecognizable, except that you recognize them, and that's the important thing. Hopefully, nobody will be able to read your book and say, aha, I know him so well now. It's amazing the number of people who after The Alienist was published, would come up and meet me in signings and discover that I was not Dr. Chrysler. That I was also, in many ways, everybody else in the book, and including the bad guy. And that I was a little scary at times. And people would sort of move away. And it's not that they were scared, it was just they were like, well, that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted him to be just like him. And that's, that's too bad. All right, we're going to go right down this road, and we'll get to all of you. Yes?
Thinking about how do you achieve how do you approach being authentic with characters? For example, if you're a white person writing about a black person or a certain
Never thought it
person
could
writing-
work.
I'm sorry?
From the first person,
From any person.
never believed it could work. I knew William Styron, kind of. We had a lot of talks about fiction when we were both very classy. I never thought Confessions of Nat Turner worked. I don't think that you can write across sexes. There's too much that men and women just don't understand about each other to be able to pull it off. And it presents you with problems. It can present you with problems. Because, like with The Alienist, everyone has been saying, oh, who's going to narrate the next book? Well, I would have enough trouble, quite frankly. They say, Osiris would be a great narrator. I can't do that. I can't put myself in the first person place of a black man in the late 19th century. I can't even imagine what that was like. In New York, possibly one of the most racist cities, certainly in Northern America. I have no idea. So that's why one of the reasons it's taken so long is in terms of finding another voice.
But, I'm thinking about Jim Harrison's novel Dalva, where he pretty much writes it from the point of view of a woman, and I was kind of impressed. I was pretty astonished at how well he did it.
I've read it. But Harrison, what was the order? I gotta go back now, think. Then it takes me way back. What was the order of his books?
Was there one with fireplace in the title?
Just the first ones,
I
is
never
all,
read all of them, but I don't remember.
just the first ones is what I'm trying to think of. While you're doing that, who was the, yeah,
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about creating atmosphere in your books. Do you
Uh-huh.
start like, characters go from A to B and then just flesh it out, or do you have some, big thing that you write and you just start simplifying?
well, I'm not sure I know what you mean.
Like, some sort of moody scene, some sort of spooky scene, something like that you're writing.
You find someplace movie.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's someplace that's really spooky, it should, this is what I say about historical writing being so important to me anyway, is that I'm never conscious of creating sort of, it always comes from reality for me, it always comes from research. All of the most horrible scenes in the Alienist, the stuff that people said that, I couldn't read that part. They were all real, they were taken from real cases. Research is where I get, almost all, the atmospherics come from growing up in New York and knowing good places to stick things, but that doesn't always work. You can't just have people go to a spooky place and expect it to be spooky. Something spooky better be going on, while they're there. And all that for me came out of research. I'd love to tell you it was pure imagination, but I've never found that imagination. It's important imagination, hugely important, obviously, but it's never enough.
Jim Harrison,
Yeah.
Returning to Earth in 1977, Legends of the Fall in 78, Dalva in 1988.
Stop. No. Yeah, I never made it through any of them.
But he also writes from the point of view of American Indian. He does a lot of characters for Indian.
And I think it's a noble effort. I just wonder how many American Indians read it.
I want to introduce myself as War and Peace.
Okay.
And what is your opinion of...
We get into subdivisions on that,
Okay, all right, Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky?
Yes,
Mixed.
mixed,
I love Notes from Underground.
okay.
I can read that over and over. Brothers Karamazov, like hitting me with a hammer.
I agree. The Idiot?
The Idiot, more so.
Okay, all right.
More is more.
The question I wanted to really ask was, do you revise as you go along, or do you do a complete draft?
Always. Every day you revise, when I'm going, once it starts going, you get up, you revise what you did the night before and realize that it's all crap, and straighten it out as much as you can, then you move forward in the later part of the writing day, whenever that is.
That is how Graham Greene said he worked, and how do you feel about Graham Greene?
I love Graham.
Okay.
I don't know why I didn't mention him.
Okay.
Somerset Maugham too, by the way. Yes?
Character names.
Oh, boy.
How do you come up with character names? You can't name everyone John Doe. Do you go
That's
to,
true.
Go to the phone book?
Sometimes, I won't say that sometimes I haven't gone to the phone book looking for a specific type of name. But each name usually has some significance, personal significance. It's like half has, either the last name or the first name has some personal significance for me, and the other half of the name is something that's real, like characters. If I'm writing about characters who are supposed to come from, in the Alienist, come from well-to-do families, you find it, you use names of people who actually were well-to-do families, but you sort of combine them in two names so that you realize you're not talking about exactly that family. You make up your own version of it, but it's, there's generally some personal meaning in there somewhere that you don't want anybody to know about. Trust me, because by the time 20 years later, you really, a lot of those people you never want to speak to again. Was there somebody behind you?
I think so.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Yeah, I think we can.
maybe kill Sid.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us.